Welcome. Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Edwards, the director of the Frist Center. Thank you so much for joining us today for Food for Thought, which is a partnership between the Frist Center and Vanderbilt University's Office of Community, Neighborhood, and Government Relations. This is our fourth year to do this at the Frist Center, and we're extremely grateful to Gail Carr-Williams, who is Associate Director of Vanderbilt University's Office of Community, Neighborhood, and Government Relations. Gail directs the Food for Thought program, which brings informed, intellectually stimulating lunchtime panels to venues such as the Frist Center, the First Amendment Center, and the War Memorial Auditorium. We also want to acknowledge the help of Chandra Allison, who's program assistant in that department. They both work very hard at pulling these events together for us. Gail is also a member of the Board of Trustees here at the Frist Center, and she chairs the Education Council, and so she knows a lot about what's going on. We're very, very grateful for all that she does for us. Much that she brings to us from the university helps us with insight on how to elevate the planning for Food for Thought, and we thank her. We'd also like to acknowledge the Metro Nashville Arts Commission, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for the Arts for their ongoing support of public programs at the Frist Center. Today our panel will discuss the topic of World War I and American art, speaking particularly to the contributions that African Americans made to the war effort, and some discussion of the aftermath as well. We are joined today with panelist Jamal Sheets, who is director of Fisk University Art Galleries. He's a member of the art faculty at Fisk University and a practicing artist. He is a native of Brentwood, Tennessee. After receiving a bachelor's degree in art from Fisk University in 2002, in 2011, he received a master's degree from Fine Art in the Studio Art from Tufts University and the School of Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, where he was awarded the honor of being the School of Museum of Fine Arts, a postgraduate teaching fellow. So we're very glad he's back in Nashville. And we also are joined by Rebecca Vanderveer, who earned her undergraduate degree from Harvard College and her PhD from Duke University. She teaches at Vanderbilt University in the Department of the History of Art. She teaches modern, contemporary African American and African art and visual culture. Her research focuses on 20th century Black women artists and African American engagements with Africa. She is also affiliated faculty member with the programs of American Studies and African American and Diaspora Studies at Vanderbilt. Moderator today is a familiar face to all of us here at the Frist Center, our own Jenny Sankson, who is curator of interpretation of the Frist. Please join me in welcoming our panelists, and thank you very much for what's going to be a very stimulating program.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here on this rainy day. We appreciate you braving Nashville traffic to get here, and we're hopefully going to have a wonderful discussion for you focused on African American artists and the Great War. So I want to thank our panelists for being here. Thank you, Rebecca and Jamal, for participating and for lending your brains to this very important topic. We're really glad we have room for this discussion. Thank you again to Vanderbilt for supporting this program and partnering with us. So my job is an easy one. I get to set up the history that we're going to be talking about. So this exhibition, World War I in American Art, is timed to coincide with the centenary of the United States entry into the First World War. And the exhibition takes an expansive look at America's wartime visual culture through the works of more than 70 artists. Known as the Great War because of its unprecedented unprecedented scale, World War I began after a Serbian nationalist assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in 1914. And alliances gradually drew across all of the major European powers and eventually across the entire globe. The United States remained neutral until 1917, when it joined forces with the Allies, which were Britain, France, Italy, Serbia, and Russia, fighting against Austria-Hungary and Germany, amongst others. And the American military proved decisive in helping the Allies win the conflict, and peace came on November 11th, 1918. So even though the United States was involved with fighting for a relatively short period of time, the war set into motion political and cultural changes that are still with us today. And the political ramifications of the war have been given a great deal of attention, but the visual culture is a bit understudied. This is the first exhibition to really focus in on this topic and give attention to the impact that the war had on American artists. For a long time, it was dismissed as kind of a blip in the radar. Art historian Milton Brown called World War I an interlude in the art world, which if you walk through the exhibition, you can see that that's not quite the case. The conflict had an impact in a variety of ways. Artists such as Child Hassam on the left stayed at home and responded to the war with patriotic works that really helped galvanize the population behind this cause. James Montgomery Flagg, in his famous I Want You for the U.S. Army, is an example of a propagandistic work of art that was to encourage enlistment after the conflict had really gotten underway and the U.S. was starting to be involved. And then you also had soldier artists such as Claggett Wilson, which you can see to the far right of the screen, who responded to the work based on his personal experiences and the horrors that he saw. So we have a variety of different expressions, but today we're going to hone in on African American artists. And the theme of this lecture series is Changing the World. So we are going to explore how World War I changed the lives and work of African American artists. And we're going to be discussing both artists whose works appear in this exhibition, artists who are in the collection of Fisk University, and also looking broadly to other collections. So to start off our discussion, Rebecca, as a specialist of modern and contemporary African American art, what was the landscape like for artists before the war began?
Sure. Well, welcome, and thank you again for inviting me to participate. I think it's really important that we understand that the landscape for African American artists before the onset of World War I looked drastically different than their white counterparts. So up until 1865 and the end of slavery, African American artistic production did not fall into the traditional categories of the fine arts. So instead of painters and sculptors, we had a number of largely undocumented now craftsmen, quilters, silversmiths, and blacksmiths. And so up until the Reconstruction era, African American artists African Americans under slavery were not given access to the same types of artistic training or freedom of movement within the United States to pursue artistic training. Post-1865, and particularly as we move into the later part of the 19th century, we do see the emergence of African American artists, particularly in the form of itinerant or traveling portraitists, who were producing portraits of freed African Americans along in a variety of places. And we see the emergence of key figures such as Henri Tanner, who we're going to talk about in a moment. But it was drastically different than white American artists who were able to travel freely to Europe to pursue artistic training, had access to art schools in the United States where they were being given a classical European academic training. So that's sort of the lay of the land leading up to the end of the 19th century. And then do we want to look at some of the Tanners? So this is probably, how many of you have seen this painting or reproduction of this painting before? Some of you. This is Henri Tanner's The Banjo Lesson from 1893. Tanner, for those of you who may be unaware, was a Pennsylvania-based artist who eventually moves to France in 1891. So he is training, and we can talk a little bit, Jamal and I, about some of his training in Philadelphia at the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts, which is the institution that originated this exhibition. But do you want to talk a little bit about Tanner?
I guess I can chime in just a little bit. Tanner's probably one of my favorite artists for a few reasons. One, but thinking about his training, he studied with Thomas Eakins. And to talk about Tanner just a little bit, I'm going to talk about him in a few ways. One is that he was classified as, or thought of as, an octoroon, which was 1/8 black. And there's some scholars say that he may have been passing when he initially tried to get into school to study. He did experience some adversity while there. Should I talk about the adversity, or okay?
Sure.
So he
well,
did.
When we use that term octoroon in passing, are those terms that are familiar to you all? Okay, so I see some no's.
Okay, good.
Head shaking no. So if you Google Henri Tanner, the ubiquitous photograph of him, it will cause you pause, right? Because he doesn't look African American, and so he was considered an octoroon, so 1/8 black, and it's thought that he passed for white, or passed himself off as being white to gain access to different experiences. And so do you want to talk a little bit about his
I could talk about that. Well, I can talk about both, but also he was a son of a Methodist preacher. And you'll see that influence later on in his work. But during the course of his training, it was said that he would be the first to leave, the first to come and the first to leave. And so one night he was in the studio and they called him there, and they took him down to the city, tied him to his easel and left him there. He experienced a great deal of racism throughout his career, and it wasn't just from white Americans, it was also from African Americans as well. There was a gentleman by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois that said that he was our national treasure and that we should support him. Again, racially, he was a difficult figure. And so, can we go to the next slide?
Before we go on, you guys had some wonderful comments about how this image really deconstructs the caricature.
Yes.
Could we touch on that?
Jamal and I could talk all day back and forth, so we invite you along with this,
Thank you for
this
that.
conversation. But yes, so one of the reasons why we wanted to show you the banjo lesson, it's one of Tanner's most reproduced paintings. Some art historians are sick of it by now, but I think it's a really important illustration, or visualization rather, of a genre scene, or sort of an everyday painting in which we see this grandfather and grandson in this tender moment, right, of passing down that lesson of learning how to strum the banjo. This would have been a radical depiction in 1893. When we think about the pervasive negative stereotypes and caricatures that were used to depict African Americans during the period of slavery, through the Reconstruction era, all the way through, well, arguably I would say today we still suffer from that. But one of the charges that African American artists found themselves facing, or charged with rather, was to deconstruct the stereotype, to produce art that provided a realistic, authentic vision of African Americans, right? And so this painting, while it doesn't seem radical to us today, right, in 2017, in 1893, Tanner's decision to paint this particular moment, to give use his canvas as a medium for his message, was radical, right? To show this moment of grandfather and grandson tenderness went against what the general public was used to seeing.
I think that's good.
That's great. And Jamal, you had some wonderful observations about the landscape of being an exhibiting artist during this period. Did you want to talk a little bit about the difficulties that were faced for artists?
Yeah, I can give another example for Tanner. Even though he was one of the first African Americans to give a solo show in New York, but prior to that, I think there's he had written, while he was living in Paris, he had written a letter to his sister who was at Tuskegee to give to Booker T. Washington, who was the president at Tuskegee, and asking to give, and Booker T. Washington was kind of the gatekeeper for New York. If you wanted to raise money for an HBCU, historically black college university, you had to go through Booker T. Washington. And so in that letter, he expressed wanting to do an exhibition. And they said, yes, you can do an exhibition. You just can't sign it and you just can't come. You can't sign your work and you can't come. And so that was something that was, you know, for many African-American artists, when you're talking about post-Reconstruction, that was the norm. But there were also conventions like universities or schools and churches where artists did have an opportunity to show their work. I don't want to give the illusion that they did not show it, and also there was a community that was supporting this work as well. We can go back to the early part of the latter part of the 19th century. You had abolitionists, or early part, abolitionists supporting African American artists. So don't think that there was no opportunity, but it was definitely a very difficult time. This particular piece is one of my favorites because it's in our collection. Yep, I have to say it, and it's actually on view right now, which is a rare treat. And it's entitled The Three Marys. One reason, and when I think about art, I think about how it relates to artists to a certain degree. And so when I look at this piece and I begin to think about Tanner as that artist that really was the first to, as I would tell my students, he would be the Steph Curry or LeBron James of the international art world. He was a big deal.
Yeah.
And so he inspired artists like Aaron Douglas and many others.
Yeah, so we mentioned that Tanner, raised in Philadelphia, the son of a Methodist minister. We do see his work takes on several different strands. There are the genre paintings, such as The Banjo Player, The Thankful Poor, another painting that you may be familiar with, and then these very religious themed and inspired paintings such as The Three Marys. The Three Marys, painted in 1910, 20 years after Tanner moves from the United States to France. So he arrives in France in 1891. Something else to remember is that New York was not the art capital of the world in the 19th century. In fact, modern art isn't introduced to American audiences until 1913. So it was a rite of passage for all American artists to travel to Europe, to spend time in France, to spend time in Italy. And so Tanner is unique in that he is one of the first African American artists to move to Paris. He studies at the famed Académie Julienne, where he is sort of ensconced in the French art world. And he achieves a measure of great success in France, is able to exhibit his works, is selling his works, and that serves as a great inspiration for African American artists coming up at the end of the 19th century. And we see Paris in particular sort of issue a siren call, if you will, to African American artists who are interested in leaving the racism behind in the United States and experiencing some of the racial freedom that they were aware that Tanner himself was experiencing while he was in France. And there's this lovely way in which he thought of himself in France, and he says, "In America, I'm Henri Tanner, Negro artist, but in France, I'm Monsieur Tanner, l'artiste américain," right? So this shift of being identified as a Negro artist in the United States to an American artist abroad. And so go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to interject too, just for a second, but even going back to The Banjo Player, The Thankful Poor, that's not what he's traditionally known for. That's only what he's known for in the U.S. But if you talk about Tanner anywhere else, they're going to talk about some of his religious genre paintings more so.
And so Tanner spends the rest of his life in Paris, dies there in 1937. A number of African-American artists travel to France to sit at his feet, receive his mentorship, go on to study at the Académie Julienne. William Edward Scott, who's represented in the exhibition here at the Frist, is one of those artists who first goes to France in 1909 and then returns during World War I. We wanted to introduce you to Tanner at this point because it's important to understand as we talk about the significance of World War I on African Americans, and in particular, in terms of our interest, African American artists, is that African American artists were already traveling to Europe prior to the onset of World War I. Although once World War I happens, we see some shifts occur.
Right, and then we get to the moment of American involvement within World War I, which also causes another shift within the landscape and within the subject matter. So in 1917, the United States goes to war with Germany and then later to Austria-Hungary. This was for a number of reasons. One of them was the Zimmermann telegram, which was decoded. It was a message from Germany to the Mexican government and basically promised, if you fight with us against all of the allies, we will help you recover the territory that you lost in the Mexican-American War. So it was a very palpable threat to the U.S. to have potential enemies so close to home. So the United States declared war in 1917, and the United States immediately began to mobilize, both encouraging enlistment and civilian support, and this also caused the war to become a major presence within American art. So let's talk about the crisis for a moment and what was going on the home front. I know it's so difficult to put ourselves in the shoes of African Americans in 1917, but could you talk a little bit about what messages were being sent to them and what they were being encouraged to do at the time?
Sure. So we know that around 350,000 African Americans served in the U.S. Army during World War I. One of the sort of inherent contradictions is in that act of service of being sent abroad to fight on behalf of the United States in World War I, that these soldiers were sent abroad experiencing the horrors of combat, also being introduced to European societies at the same moment that they were not considered fully citizens of the United States, right? And so that's that weird moment in which you're being asked to put your life on the line for a country that fully doesn't fully recognize you. And so we see, these 350 African-American soldiers sent off to war, and their experiences begin to be covered in popular Black publications of the era. So on screen here is an illustration from The Crisis, which was a publication that began circulation in 1910, the official publication of the NAACP, edited by W.E.B. Du Bois. And at the time that the United States entered into World War I, this particular publication had a circulation of around 74,000. At the end of World War I, its circulation was 100,000. That was higher than mainstream publications such as The Nation. So just to give you a sense of the readership of The Crisis, it was aimed at African American audiences, and we see a number of illustrations and writings published in The Crisis during the World War I period, aimed at elucidating what the experiences were for African American soldiers. And W.E.B. Du Bois used it as an opportunity to voice some of his salient opinions about sort of that return home, what happens to African Americans when they return home. Did you want to say anything? Okay. And this is a William Edward Scott piece. Do we want to talk about him?
Well, I can talk about William E. Scott a little bit. William E. Scott is also one of these artists that we have in our collection. I'm really excited that he's a part of the show World War I, The Great Migration at Fisk. In our collection, we have a few works. One would be of the Haitian market, which was funded by the Rosenwald Fund, which was founded right after World War I. And the Rosenwald Fund established small one-room schools throughout the U.S. I think it was 5,000 schools that they built post-World War I. But also we have two portraits of the Jubilee Singers, one in front of the Queen and then one with them sitting. And so we're super excited to have that work in our collection. So.
And this work is on display. We have a facsimile on display within the exhibition. So if you're curious as to hearing more about this particular piece and the crisis, it is covered in our audio tour and our interpretive text.
Yeah, and William Edward Scott, as I mentioned, was an African-American artist who had traveled to France prior to the onset of World War I. He's there in 1909. He meets with Henri Tanner. He is experiencing all the wonders that Paris has to offer. And then he goes back in 1914 and does a series of illustrations focusing specifically on the experience of the African-American soldier. And those illustrations, such as the one we see here, are published, reproduced in Crisis. So again, this is pre-television, pre-Google, and so these illustrations really provided a window for the public to gain access. And here we see, this is sort of War, the Grim Emancipation, which is a pretty salient commentary on sort of the lack of emancipatory effects of the war. So, but Scott becomes an important figure in terms of documenting those experiences and then his connections not only to Tanner but to the crisis as well.
I would also just add that he also went to Art Institute of Chicago, so I think
yeah.
it's important to mention that note.
And another name that coming up again and again as we were getting ready for this panel discussion was Horace Pippin, who has 3 original artworks in the exhibition in our neighboring galleries, as well as a reproduction of a very fragile wartime memoir that you can see projected here. So can we take a moment to discuss Pippin's contribution as an artist to the field?
So I have to say, you must take advantage of seeing these Pippins in person. They are amazing to behold in the gallery, and I am remiss to say that I had yet to see one that we'll talk about in a moment in person until I was here. So please take advantage of being able to view them while you're here. So Pippin is an interesting character within the history of African American art. He serves in World War I, but doesn't become an artist per se until he's quite older. He turns to art at age 37. And in fact, this memoir of his experiences in World War I was produced after he returned. So it has this, and this is a facsimile that has been reproduced from papers held by the Smithsonian Archives of American Art. But we see here his sort of recollection, both textual and visual, of that experience of fighting in the war. So should we look at the other one?
Yeah, the one that Rebecca was mentioning, you must see. I think this is the one that got you really excited, isn't it?
Yeah, so this is The End of War, Starting Home, 1930 to 1933. Pippin, while serving in World War I, suffered a very severe injury to his right arm, which essentially rendered it unusable. When he returned to the States, he began to experiment with alternate modes of expression, particularly using sort of a burnt poker to burn elements into wood. Pyography, I think is the way you pronounce that. And so we see him begin to use art as a way to process his experiences, sort of as a therapeutic exercise. And so here we see an example of his praxis. He would, as I mentioned, he had been right-handed before he was injured, and then after his injury, would use his left arm to sort of guide his right arm as he was executing his works. He's largely considered to be what we refer to as a self-taught artist, in that he did not receive sort of formal artistic training. That has impacted his reception within the field of African American and American art history. He eventually, at the end of the 1930s, is part of a traveling show that was exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art. So this is a moment in which we see a celebration of the self-taught artists. Some of you may be familiar with Nashville's very own William Edmondson, who was the first African-American artist to have a solo show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1937. So Pippin is coming of age at this moment in using his paintings and his sort of, here it's more of a collage painting where he's added sort of the grenades and helmets that we can see on the exterior of the frame.
You know, one thing that we talked about earlier about looking at Pippin's work, and if we go to the next slide, maybe a better example. But we were talking earlier about Romare Bearden and how you see this kind of language coming out of this work. And so I think it's important just to point that out where it almost feels as if it's a collage.
And this one, we remarked upon the date of this work. If anyone has trouble seeing, this is called the Barracks, and it dates to 1945. And that might surprise a lot of people. You know, why is he revisiting this subject so many years after this his experience has passed? But did you guys want to talk about what was happening and why he might have come back to this subject matter in the 40s?
Absolutely. And so thinking about it as from an artist perspective, I was speaking to a group of artists and curators a few weeks ago, and they were talking about the trauma of now and how are artists coping with it and dealing with it. Well, it takes time to really process. And so we're looking here, he's reflecting back, and same thing with the journal. He's reflecting back to his time overseas and then starting to reincorporate that and thinking about ways how to talk about it or to share it. And we see that represented there. And this is probably a clearer distinction of that kind of layering that we talked about earlier, looking at Bearden. And then also what you talked about earlier, speaking about Tanner, about what artists are doing, deconstructing that caricature. And so you're seeing these kind of mundane things, these kind of, you know, just sitting in the barracks. And that's something that, you know, again, we're deconstructing the caricature and saying this is how we actually live and not the stereotypes.
It's a very humanizing image, isn't it? Just of this quiet moment.
Yeah, and we had been speaking, so this is in the collection of the Phillips collection in Washington, D.C., which also owns half of the Jacob Lawrence Migration Series panels, which some of you may be familiar with, which were produced in 1940, 1941. So, you know, this Pippin is sort of a genre scene executed in his quote unquote naive style, in that we see, you know, the figures aren't sort of fully modeled. It has that air of, it's an oil on canvas, but almost looks like it could be a tempera on canvas in terms of the finish. So he is committed to sort of telling that African-American experience, right? And so there's that desire, as you know, we keep using that phrase, deconstructing the stereotype or challenging the caricature. And that was still at the forefront of these artists' prerogatives at this period.
And then some artists did it different ways. And so I can't help but to think about going back to William E. Scott and his training, and then comparing him to an artist like Aaron Douglas, who was constantly reaching back to the continent and pulling some of these silhouettes or some of these other objects, whereas Pippin or even Scott, I mean, I would say Scott did not. He was more classically and traditionally trained. And so you see a variation of artists in terms of artistic production about the way that artists are expressing themselves.
And then our next artist that we wanted to mention was Dux Thrash, and this is kind of an unusual example of his work because he was a printmaker, or most well known as a printmaker. But what aspects of his work do you think that we can use to open up a broader discussion about African Americans in World War I?
I think it's important to talk about some of the early relationships. We just talked about William E. Scott. And William E. Scott he went to University of Chicago, but also so did Dux Thrash. And he was mentored by William E. Scott. And so I think it's important to point that out.
Yeah, so Dux Thrash, as Jenny mentioned, we consider now largely to be a printmaker, very active in the 1930s with the WPA and Federal Arts Project during the Great Depression. But he, in fact, had his artistic training predates the onset of the Depression, and looking into his biography, so he's born in the South, and so when we think about movement, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but we have not only the movement of African Americans from the U.S. abroad, but at the same time, there's a movement of African Americans from the rural South to northern urban industrialized centers, and Jamal's going to talk a little bit more about that period that we know as the Great Migration. But Dux Thrash leaves home very young. He leaves home at the age of 15. And he's on the road for several years. And while he's on the road, there's 325 lynchings of young black men while he is sort of en route. So he is coming of age at a very challenging, dangerous time. He ends up in Chicago, arriving there first in 1911. He enrolls in evening classes at the Art Institute of Chicago, where we saw him come into contact with William Edward Scott. He's also in corresponding with Elaine Locke, Dr. Elaine Locke, who is famous for being the first African American recipient of the Rhodes Scholarship. He becomes ensconced at Howard University in the 1920s and becomes the sort of cultural spokesperson of the Harlem Renaissance that we'll touch upon in a little bit. But Thrash, so he's living in Chicago. He's taking evening classes at the Art Institute of Chicago when he joins the Army in September of 1917. He ends up getting shipped to France from Hoboken, New Jersey in September of 1918. And he's there. He ends up being wounded, severely wounded in October of 1918. If we think about the timeline of World War I, we end our American engagement in November of 1918. So he is injured right on the sort of tail end of the war. And so he's gassed and suffers from shell shock. He spends the winter recovering in France, in a hospital in France, before he's able to come back to the United States, where he's able to resume studying at the Art Institute in Chicago, now no longer just an evening student, night class student, but a full-time student. And that's a really important thing to talk about, right? So the being able to devote yourself full-time to your artistic training. He had some government support to do that. When we see the passage of the GI Bill in 1944, we do see an increase in veterans returning to colleges and universities. And based on my own research at Howard, I know that the Howard University Art Department saw a dramatic increase in studio art majors, in particular post-World War II. Do you want to say anything else?
So we've gotten to the period of discussing what comes next, what comes after the war. So as Rebecca mentioned, we have the armistice signed on the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. And really the entire globe was reeling from this conflict. We had millions of soldiers dead or wounded, millions of civilians dead from disease, starvation, or exposure. So can we talk a little bit about what was the landscape of America like for soldiers returning? What were they coming back to?
That's always kind of an interesting question to kind of tackle and to think about. We were talking earlier about a soldier that came back in Georgia. First name was Wilbur. I can't think of his last name. And when he came back to the U.S., he got off the train. He had his uniform on, and they required a group of gentlemen came up to him and said, "You got to take it off. Take your clothes off." And so he ended up having to strip. And he wore his uniform again out in public, and they threatened. They told him, said, "Don't wear your uniform again. Don't put it back on." And when he put his uniform back on and went out in public, they lynched him. And so, and that was in a small town in Georgia. And so we can't say that the welcome was great, just to say the least. But when you think about what was going on during the World War and post-World War, the South, you had a boll weevil or some kind of epidemic that killed the cotton crops. And so then also during World War I, you had all the industrialization and all those jobs in the North. And so you saw mass migration of people to fill those jobs, one for the war effort, but then also the country was changing. And so that started to provide some racial tension that was going on. And so you had these trained soldiers that had been celebrated overseas, and they were not when they came back, many of which.
And I don't think that we mentioned this, but the treatment of African American soldiers in France was quite good from the French government. They were honored with several Legion of Honor awards, and they were really treated as full participants in this conflict. So then coming back, it must have been jarring for the soldiers to then face again rampant segregation and discrimination.
Absolutely, and I think we talked about earlier about, or in preparation for this, we talked about how they were pamphlets that were disseminated that talked about how do you treat African American soldiers. One other thing that we didn't talk about, maybe we did, was Tanner, and that he volunteered for the Red Cross while he was there. You can.
Yeah, so Tanner, when World War I starts, joins the Red Cross and is eventually given, I think, a Legion of Honor medal by the French government afterwards for his service. And so we see, and I think, should we move to the Vanderzee photos?
Yes,
So we do see a number of African American servicemen honored, right, returning as decorated war heroes, but returning to a country that is troubled, that is not sure how to handle them, in that tension that that Jamal was mentioning, percolates and eventually boils over in the summer of 1919, and we'll talk a little bit about the race riots that occur during that summer. But on screen here are two photographs taken by famed Harlem Renaissance photographer James Vanderzee. A side note that Jamal and I had talked about, that if any of you ever use Everything But the House, the online estate sale website, two Vanderzees went up for sale out of Nashville a few weeks ago, and we realized that we had been bidding against each other for them.
We did not get them.
We did not get them. So, but he knows who did. So I did not end up with them. But Vanderzee was known for his studio photography. It's also important to recognize that these photographs, we are consuming them today in the context of a fine arts museum. At the time of production, these were not considered sort of fine arts photographs. Rather, no different than some of you might have, your holiday card sessions coming up with your photographer that you're paying to have these images taken. This was very similar. Vanderzee had a popular Harlem area studio replete with props and et cetera. And so you could go and have your photograph taken. Ginny, did you want to let us know a little bit about who he's pictured here?
Yes, so here we have Needham Roberts and Henri Johnson, and these are two of the African American soldiers who were highly celebrated when they came back. They have this really incredible story. They both fought with the Harlem Hellfighters. which if you need a wonderful subject to dive into, read about the Harlem Hellfighters. They were an incredible group of men, never lost a man nor an inch of ground to the enemy within the entirety of the war. And Needham Roberts and Henry Johnson were on sentry duty one evening, and a large number of German troops attacked their trench. The numbers are fuzzy, anywhere from 10 to 20, but they were wildly outnumbered. Each sustained multiple stab wounds all over their body. It was amazing that they survived, but they actually repelled the entire attack, saved their troop, and managed to survive and tell the tale. So they actually went on kind of a lecture circuit in the U.S. So these would have been, memorabilia that people would have been able to collect. But here you see them in 1919 and then in 1932. Is there anything else we wanted to say about James Van Der Zee?
I think what I will say briefly as we move on to this next sort of, as we're entering this post-World War I period, is that Van Der Zee and these photographs, I think, exemplify that. When we think of that notion of deconstructing the stereotype or the caricature, the desire to sort of take control over your self-representation, and how these two photographs we see, if we know that this is a collaboration between the photographer and the sitter, that sort of money is exchanged for these photographs. And so clearly Van Der Zee would want to please his client. That these poses, while obviously Van Der Zee is, advising them, for the best photographic composition, that think about why you get your photograph taken. Why do you pay to have someone take your photo? How do you choose what you're going to wear for that photograph? And so the fact that we see the Roberts and Johnson here sort of sitting by the sort of faux fireplace in their uniforms, and then 10 years later still sporting their medals and their decorations, in light of that sort of newfound pride in identity. And we see that bleed over into the 1920s with the start of the Harlem Renaissance, which is a sort of a cultural renaissance and sort of embrace of what we term now sort of the new Negro movement and identity.
And so one thing, as we were looking back at the previous slide, I kept thinking about 1919 and how that's not an image. When I close my eyes and think about the images that came out during that time, that's not what I think about. We talked briefly about the race riots, the Red Summer. And out of that, there's another sociologist who ended up becoming the first African-American president of Fisk University, was Charles S. Johnson. That's when he and many other Harlem Renaissance artists and scholars, that's where they got their start, was post-World War I. And so Charles S. Johnson, he served in World War I as a non-commissioned officer. But during the race riots, that's where he did his studies. He was at the University of Chicago, and he created a text that kind of became the guide for race relations or race investigations. And that was a Negro in Chicago, a study of race relations and race riots. Later on, he became the figure that would be called the entrepreneur, the architect of the Harlem Renaissance. You talked about Alan Locke earlier, and he was considered to be the dean. So you start to see some of these roles as they're shaping this movement moving forward.
All right, so we mentioned the Harlem Renaissance a couple of times, but why don't we just unpack what exactly that was and how World War I really contributed to the emergence of this time period and artistic movement?
Sure. So I think what we see happening with World War I and its influence on the trajectory of African American art is we see on the one hand the experience of African Americans abroad, right? Going, and that's not to say that France doesn't have its own troubled history with people with brown skin. So the legacy of colonialism, France is a colonial power at that time during World War I, but that we see African Americans experiencing a new sense of racial freedom abroad at that same moment that they're not being considered full citizens in the United States. So they come back with that experience at the same moment that we see that movement of African Americans from predominantly southern rural areas to northern industrialized locations, New York, Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, and this particular painting that one of the curators of the exhibition brought to my attention this weekend, we thought was fitting to think about sort of that sense of movement. Here we are on the subway, that train movement within the city, and we see that at the start of the 1920s, there is an interest in what Jamal and I have mentioned as the new Negro identity. So what happens to the African American now that they've moved from the South, are now in these urban industrialized centers and are able to craft new identities?
And I think a great deal of that, you touched on it earlier, talking about this idea of freedom. And so as they're moving to these urban centers, then they start to develop this freedom of expression. And so you'll see that.
And Jamal, we would be remiss if we didn't encourage people not only to go to the exhibition that we have here, but also the exhibition that you have, World War I and the Great Migration, up at Fisk University Galleries. So what do you want to tell visitors about that exhibition and its connection to what we have here?
Absolutely. The exhibition kind of goes in tandem with what you all have here. It's called World War I, the Great Migration. And so we're looking at artists like Malvin Gray Johnson, who would not necessarily be considered a part of this time period, but he leaves Virginia in 1918, shortly after the war. It also has William E. Scott in it, Albert E. Smith, who also served in World War I, and several other artists. And so what we're looking at is World War I, but then 6 million African Americans moving to, as you said, New York, Chicago, Cleveland, and then westward. And then in that, and we keep talking about it, I almost feel like I'm on repeat talking about deconstructing the caricature, because what you'll see is everyday life. You'll see a soldier. You will see, I'll rewind just a little bit. We also have Tanner, but then also we look at Reconstruction too. So it's kind of creating this timeline as you go through the exhibition. We'll have a Maggie Porter portrait that was done in the 1890s, who was a Jubilee singer.
And talking about kind of revisiting what we think we know, Rebecca, you commented that this exhibition probably wouldn't have looked the same if it had been put together 10, 15 years ago. Can you explain what makes this exhibition at this time period special?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've seen happen over the last 10 to 15 years is sort of a reshaping of the canon of American art, right? Where it is amazing to see several African American artists included in this particular exhibition, whereas 10 to 15 years ago, you may have seen a gallery label that included a statistic about African American soldiers serving in World War I, but their voices wouldn't have been given a platform within the exhibition itself. So this particular exhibition is sort of elucidating and I think opening up new avenues of scholarship in really unique ways, right? In which people, hopefully, as all exhibitions do, sort of allow us to think more broadly about a topic and a particular set of artists and leads to more research, right? And so hopefully this show, which is fantastic, and I hope you all spend a lot of time there, and then also head over to Fisk to see the excellent presentation that Jamal and his staff have put together to really sort of understand the context a little bit more.
That's great. Well, thank you both so much for your participation in this and for sharing your thoughts. We would love to take some questions from the audience. And we've got a microphone that my colleague Megan is going to be running. So if you would raise your hand if you have a question, then everyone can hear your question. It looks like we've got one right up here.
I was intrigued by the three Marys. What do they represent? Something different than I'm thinking about?
They actually, Mary Magdalene, Mary, I can't think of the three Marys' names.
Mary, the Virgin Mary?
Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene and Mary...
Mary who washed the feet
of Jesus, yep.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Do we have another question? Oh, I see a red shirt in the back. Oh, she's coming to you.
I used to play hooky in Chicago and go to the Art Institute. I was curious about you mentioning that some of these artists actually were trained at the Art Institute. Was that unusual for African American artists that early to
Well,
get
that's a
that kind
great
of training?
question. Jamal, did you want to comment to that?
That's, I can't necessarily say I can answer that question, but I can tell you that the Art Institute of Chicago has probably trained more African American artists than any other institution, period. Yeah.
Oh,
Where was the crisis published out of?
that is.
I was hoping no one was going to ask a real factual question here, right? I believe it was published out of New York, but that's easily, Google can be your friend in that regard. There's been a lot of stuff on Crisis. So Crisis began publication in 1910. The other prominent, and so we can talk about the Crisis in terms of race journalism. And so it was a magazine, but there was a lot of coverage of African American involvement in World War I in publications like the Chicago Defender. We have Opportunity magazine, published by the Negro Urban League, which begins publication, I think, a little bit later, maybe 1914. So there's a number of journals. But I did think it's striking that it had a circulation higher than a mainstream publication like The Nation at that time.
And if you're curious to see more of what's in the crisis and read the articles, I believe that every single issue has been digitized and is available on the web. So go deep diving. There's a lot of fun to be had.
Would you comment on why they were celebrated in France? Because my memory serves, they served only under French officers because of Mr. Pershing's prejudice.
Does anyone want to take this, or I can comment on it to start? I think by the time American involvement began, France was desperate for help. This was a country that was really bogged down in the war for a very, very long time. So by the time African American soldiers arrived at the front, French officers were just happy to have help. They were happy to have able bodies. And so they did treat these men as full participating soldiers. And Jamal mentioned the pamphlet that was circulated. That was published by the United States government to the French government. And it basically came down to, don't treat these men as full soldiers. You really need to keep an eye on them. They're really not going to work hard. It was pretty horrific, and it was distributed and then followed up, I believe, the next day with a memo saying disregard this completely by the French government. So I think that they were appreciative of the efforts of these men and happy to have them there.
And the only other thing that I would add is also when you think about the timeline in terms of race relations in Europe, it's slightly different. It's different than the U.S. And so some of we talk about segregation and all of that, and that necessarily didn't happen the same way as it did in the U.S. And so different perception.
Going back to the University of Chicago piece, thank you. Was it solely in the studio arts that African Americans were welcomed, or was there a general culture? Why Chicago? There were so many race relations issues in Chicago.
So that's a great question. I think that, and as you point out, sort of, even, northern cities like Boston were not immune from racial conflict. I think that the Art Institute in Chicago, I think a lot of what paved the way for artists, African American artists, was having sort of a trailblazer, right? So William Edward Scott being at the Art Institute of Chicago made that sort of an option for Dux Thrash, right? Henri Tanner training at PAFA. Some of you may be familiar with Meta Warwick Fuller, an African-American woman sculptor who also trained at PAFA. But there were not, the decision to become an artist was not a popular one, I would say, in the sense that in terms of there was a popular ideology of the talented 10th and sort of being the best, representative of your race, right? So in terms of the numbers of people, and I mean, I would imagine it would have to do with who was teaching at the Art Institute of Chicago at the time and who was in charge of letting them in. I don't know.
I mean, I just think it's a complex question that I'm trying to kind of unpack, but then I'm thinking about what were they actually majoring in. And so many of them were actually majoring in illustration. So we're not thinking fine art or painting, but we're thinking illustration. But then on the other side, I'm thinking about Charles Johnson, who's at the University of Chicago, who went on to get his PhD there. And so, I guess I can only think about that Chicago was very open to that type of scholarship, but I don't know necessarily the definitive answer of why. And many other scholars went to school in Chicago. So.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one. All right. Well, I think we've completely saturated you with information, so thank you so much.